Bon dia, welcome to Exploring Timor-Leste, the podcast that talks about Southeast Asia's best kept travel secret. I'm your host Jonty, and I'll share first-hand insights, expert interviews and practical travel tips. Whether you're a traveller, a culture lover or just curious about places rarely covered in the mainstream, you're in the right place. Let's explore Timor-Leste. If you're looking for a different perspective on life and a way to make a real contribution, Timor-Leste is a remarkable place to volunteer. I spent a year living in Dili, the capital, volunteering with a local NGO, a government department and supported several local small businesses. It was an unforgettable and deeply rewarding experience. Volunteering in a country very different from your own isn't always easy and it isn't for everyone, but it can be a genuinely life-changing experience. This episode draws on my own experience and from conversations with locals, expats and other volunteers. I'm going to break it into 6 questions to answer. Number 1, why volunteer in Timor-Leste? 2, which organisation to volunteer through? 3, which organisation to volunteer with? 4, advice for those considering volunteering? 5, impact and legacy. What difference can you actually make? And 6, reverse culture shock. Coming home can be harder than leaving. So number 1, why volunteer in Timor-Leste? Timor-Leste is one of the youngest countries in the world and it's still developing its institutions, systems and infrastructure. There are many opportunities for skilled volunteers to make a meaningful contribution, especially in areas like education, health, agriculture, governance and community development. Volunteering assignments vary widely. Some last a few months, others several years. Increasingly, there are remote or hybrid options available, so you can support from overseas or spend some time in Timor and spend time at home. Depending on the organisation, you may receive support with travel, insurance, accommodation and living costs, or be expected to self-fund and organise everything yourself. Regardless of the model, volunteering in Timor will give you a new perspective, challenge your assumptions and allow you to play a small part in a country building its future. Number 2, which organisation to volunteer through? So you can volunteer directly in Timor-Leste, but it's probably going to be quite hard. There's lots of logistics and bureaucracy and things to manage. So most people who are volunteering will do it through an organisation and they will partner with a local organisation. Now, many governments back volunteer programs funded by their foreign affairs departments to promote soft power. And those are good organisations. They're generally well established with a track record for volunteering. But they do tend to require you to be a citizen of the country if the organisations are government funded. Now, this is an exhaustive list, but it's quite a long list of various organisations that can help support you with volunteering in Timor-Leste. So to start with the Peace Corps, this is for American citizens only. Now, all the positions are based outside of Dili, generally in remote rural locations, with around half the roles focused on teaching English and the other half on community economic development and youth development. They spend a few months learning local language Teton, although some places they don't actually speak Teton, they have their own language as well, local dialect, and the volunteers will be living with local families. So this is very much at the extreme end of volunteering, that you're in a remote local community where pretty much nobody is like to speak much English. Peace Corps have been operating in Timor-Leste since 2002. Volunteers do 2-year postings in country as standard. They have about 40 volunteers in country and they bring people in once a year as a cohort. You have to be solo. So generally most Peace Corps volunteers are fresh out of university. Some people later in life do it, but generally it's one of the kind of younger volunteer communities. They do have quite a lot of rules. They are not allowed to drive a car or a motorbike in Timor-Leste or a scooter. But they are allowed to ride bicycles, which I feel would be far more dangerous than riding a scooter. Slightly different model compared to some of the other volunteer organisations, but Peace Corps have an excellent reputation. They have a lot of support for their volunteers, both people in country, and they also have a regional base in Bangkok that supports the Southeast Asian region. Now, for New Zealanders like myself, who are either citizens or permanent residents, Volunteer Service Abroad is the organisation to go for. They've been operating in Timor-Leste also since 2002, and they have assignments for specific roles to apply for, which are typically 12 months, but the length varies, and there are some hybrid roles available. The vast majority of their roles are in Dili, although they are starting to have more roles outside of the capital. They have staff based in New Zealand and also in-country staff who provide extensive support. And accompanying partners can come with volunteers. Volunteer Service Abroad is aimed typically at people later in their career. They may have retired or are looking for a mid-career break. They typically have between 6 and 12 volunteers in country, and VSA will cover accommodation, insurance, medical, flights, and electricity, and also you get a monthly expense allowance. So it shouldn't cost you anything to be in country. Obviously, you're not earning a salary, but all your costs are covered. Now, Australia has a similar organisation called Australia Volunteers International, AVI, and they have a similar model in terms of specific roles to apply for. They're aimed again at people later in their kind of careers. Their roles are typically 9 to 15 months in duration, and they again also have a mixture of in-country and hybrid opportunities, and most of their roles are in Dili, and you may be able to bring accompanying partners. And they also have a similar number to New Zealand in terms of volunteers in country. They get the highest expense allowance, but they also have to organise pretty much everything themselves. So they have to organise their own accommodation, whereas VSA will organise accommodation on behalf of their volunteers, and Peace Corps will organise things as well on behalf of their volunteers. Now, for Japanese, there's the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, and they deploy what they call Japanese Overseas Cooperation Volunteers, so JOCV. And those typically are skilled professionals between the ages of 20 and 39, so probably comparable, maybe, or slightly older than Peace Corps, but younger than VSA and AVI, and they're doing 2-year assignments. And they've been in Timor-Leste since 2010, and up to 2023, they'd had 129 volunteers in the country over the previous 13 years, so that's 10 a year on average. And they focus on agriculture, tourism, health and social welfare, and education and sports. And most of their volunteers are Dili based. There are a surprising number of Koreans in Timor-Leste. It's on the same time zone, and the Korea International Cooperation Agency, KOICA, they operate a thing called World Friends Korea. This is for Korean citizens only, and they've been in Timor-Leste since 2005, and they have volunteers in Dili and other municipalities, and typically have 1 to 2 year assignments. United Nations Volunteers is open to any nationality, and this is the UN's Global Volunteer Programme, which runs under the UNDP, UN Development Programme, and that's designed to bolster peace and development across 130 countries globally. And their assignments are between 6 and 24 months long. They also are paid. Now, you don't get what you would get if you were doing the job as a job, but you certainly get a lot more than you if you were volunteering for some of the other organisations. So UN Volunteers is an option, and it's seen as a bit of a gateway into other UN organisations if that's of interest. Now, in Australia, there's also an organisation called Palms Australia, which is an independent NGO. And unlike the others, the volunteers are usually based outside of Dili. It's been in Timor-Leste since 2002. They advertise specific roles, which are typically 1 to 3 years long. And you're expected to do either more self-funding, or there would be less covered, again, as a charity. The other organisations are generally government funded, between sort of 90 and 100% from governments. So they can be a little bit more generous. There may also be some opportunities with local NGOs. A few of the better known ones are Maluk Timor, who do health sector capacity building, Blue Ventures, which focus on marine conservation, the Alola Foundation, which was set up by the wife of the current Prime Minister, and that focuses on women's rights and maternal health, Permatower, which is sustainable agriculture, and CNC, which is a Timor Coffee Cooperative, and they sometimes look for volunteers to assist with marketing or training. Also, Timor-Leste is a very religious country. 98% of the population are Catholic, and so there are a number of religious organisations like Catholic Relief Services or Jesuit Refugee Service or Salutations of Don Bosco, who also may provide opportunities for people to volunteer in Timor. So that was an overview of some of the organisations you can volunteer through who will help support you volunteering in Timor-Leste. But you don't volunteer generally with them, apart from those last local NGOs I mentioned. They will connect you with local communities or local organisations to volunteer with. And those local communities and local organisations are driving the kind of roles that they're seeking. So the idea is that most of those organisations will have a partner organisation. So, for example, VSA, the New Zealand organisation that I was volunteering through, they had a partnership with Hamnasa, which was a local Timorese NGO, and Hamnasa needed certain skill set, and so they developed an assignment description jointly, and then VSA would then advertise that. I applied from New Zealand for the role and then got that role in Timor. So that's the way it should work. It's based on local needs as to what they want rather than being imposed from externally. So it's important to think about the organisation you're ultimately going to volunteer, because that will actually make quite a big difference to your experience in Timor-Leste. So consider who your partner organisation could be. Some options are international NGOs, which would be like Oxfam, UN agencies, UNICEF, local NGOs, Hamnasa. You could have a government department, a Ministry of Tourism, local communities, organisations, or schools. So there's quite a variety of different organisations you may be working with. Now, here are 6 things that you should consider when you're thinking about the kind of organisation that you want to volunteer with. And you should ask these questions of the volunteering organisation to find out what the situation is, because it's all very specific to the role and the opportunity. So number 1 is language. So English is widely used in international and UN settings. Teton is the main language in local NGOs, schools and government departments. So that will have an impact on your duration, which is point number 2. So how long do you want to volunteer for? Generally, the longer the better, because you get to build the relationships and you get to be more useful because they know what you can do and you know where the needs are. Now, at least 6 months, I'd say, is the minimum for making a meaningful impact. A year is great, 2 years even better, depending on obviously how you're finding the situation. But from a partner organisation perspective, they see quite a lot of volunteers. And if they're getting quite a lot of churn of volunteers, that's not necessarily the best thing for the organisation. It might be a good thing for the volunteers because it's quite an experience being in Timor, but for organisations, they tend to like a longer placement. And so when it comes to language, if English is your primary language and you haven't really got very good language skills, then you might be best in an organisation if you're going to be there for a shorter period where they speak English predominantly. If you are good at picking up languages, and I have to say Teton is a relatively straightforward language, now that's something you can consider. But if you're in a local NGO or school, the day-to-day language may be Teton, so it's quite a bit of a bar to approach at the beginning. That's where the likes of Peace Corps and some of the other volunteer organisations, they will provide language learning training for you because it is important to speak the local language. Question number 3 to ask is around capacity versus capability building. So are you providing hands-on help, which is building their capacity or supporting their capacity, or are you mentoring others, which is around capability? Capacity is good for a short period, but when you leave, you obviously take that capacity with you. Whereas the idea around building capability is it lasts beyond your time in the organisation. So ideally, it's very much focused on capability building. From my perspective, I feel that a combination of the two is the ideal because you can help build capability through some of the capacity work you do. And it depends on the situation you're in. It can be quite hard to just do mentoring all the time. It's quite nice to actually get your hands dirty and do some of the doing as well. But that's something to consider about the role you're taking on and how much of a focus there is on the capacity, which is filling a gap, versus the capability, which is building the capability of the organisation. Question number 4 to ask is around the partner organisation, their past experience with volunteers. So has the organisation worked with volunteers before? The organisations I work with, they hadn't had a huge amount of experience with volunteers, and so there was a bit of a learning curve. With some of my friends were in organisations where they've had a number of volunteers over the years, and they definitely had an easier induction process, and then people just have a better idea about what volunteers can do. So that's a good question to ask. Question number 5 is your fit. And this should be done really by the volunteering organisation, which is, do your skills and experience match the role and local context? So do you have what they need to help? Now, often they might ask for relatively high levels of skill, but when you get there on the ground, you'll find that you're going to be doing some pretty basic stuff, just given the level of maturity in a lot of organisations in Timor. So you've got to be willing to maybe do the big picture strategic stuff, but also do some of the practical hands-on work is as valuable in terms of building capacity and capability in your partner organisation. Final question number 6 is, who is your key contact? So will you have a mentor or a counterpart you can work with on the ground? The assignments that tend to go well, you have a very highly motivated and committed partner person on the ground who you work with on a day-to-day basis and you're really skilling and working closely with. The ones that don't tend to go so well are the ones where there isn't a clear accountability or somebody that you're specifically working with and you can get a bit lost in the organisation. Section number 4 is some advice for those considering volunteering. So I've got 5 pieces of advice around this. Number 1, be clear why you're volunteering. It's not a holiday and it will be tough at times. Number 2 is the recruitment and deployment process can take a long time. It obviously depends on the organisation and situation, but I'd allow at least 6 months. So consider how that fits with your life plans and any decisions that you need to make. Consideration number 3 is organisations do a good job of preparing you for the reality of the assignments, but it's one thing to hear about something, and another to actually experience it. Certainly my experience with VSA, we did a very thorough briefing session in New Zealand before we went to Timor, and there was a lot of information, but it's not until you're on the ground that really the sights and smells and the noises, and it's a different kind of experience. So yes, you can prepare to a degree, but ultimately you just have to embrace what happens because it is what it is. Consideration number 4, if you're going with a partner, which some organisations allow and some don't, consider what they will do if you're not both volunteering full time. Although I have to say, if you're just doing the shopping and washing and life admin in Timor, can feel like a full-time job at times. It is useful to have, if you're in a partnership, to have one of you with a little bit of capacity to do some of that life admin. Although there is a number of expats in Dili, it's not a massive hub, and so you should consider what your partner may do. If you might be busy and fully committed, engaged doing the volunteering, but if a partner's sitting around at home bored, then that's not necessarily going to work out for the pair. Finally, just be aware that everything takes longer and is harder to do in a developing country, so patience is required. Section 5, impact and legacy. What difference can you actually make? So when people ask about volunteering, the question of impact always comes up, and that's rightly so. There's a lot of discussion in development circles about volunteerism, or the idea that people flying in to help without understanding the context. The last thing you want to do is feel like you did more harm than good. So what does meaningful, respectful impact look like? So first of all, you need to understand your role. You're not there to fix anything. You're not there to save anyone. You're there to support, listen, and share skills, ideally in a way that continues after you leave. So impact could look like training somebody in the organisation so they can build their skills and experience going forward, helping building a system or a toolkit that gets left behind that's useful to the organisation, contributing to long-term goals, even if your part feels small at the time, being present, so reliable, respectful, and being patient. And legacy is subtle but real. So you may not be able to build a school or transform an entire organisation, but you might help a colleague feel more confident, you might show a different way of solving a problem, you might open a door for someone. And just as much, Timor-Leste will leave a legacy for you in how you see the world, how you relate to others, and how you define what matters. Other ways to leave a positive legacy include handover documentation for your replacement. I know when I was in my volunteer organisation, they'd had a previous volunteer, but they'd lost all the materials that volunteer had worked on. So that's a real shame and a waste of some of their time and resource. So making sure that what you do will last. You can continue to offer mentoring or support remotely. So this is one of the things I'm doing with this podcast, is I've now left Timor-Leste, but I'm still keen to contribute and support Timor-Leste as a tourism destination. And you can also share your experiences to inspire others, advocate for Timor-Leste, or raise awareness of the country's needs and strengths. I'm sure my friends and family would have known very little about Timor-Leste, and now they probably know quite a lot about Timor-Leste, having heard about me talk about it for the last couple of years. So in short, you can make a difference, but it starts with humility, listening, and a long-term mindset. And finally, something worth considering before you volunteer is what's going to happen after you volunteer. So the reverse culture shock. Coming home can actually be harder than leaving. So one of the things that often surprises volunteers is that returning home can be more emotionally jarring than arriving in Timor-Leste. It's called reverse culture shock. When you first arrive in Timor, things are unfamiliar, they're sometimes frustrating, often beautiful, but you expect the experience. You should be in the mindset that you're doing this thing and you're prepared to adapt. And after a while, you should find your rhythm and you might even start to feel at home. And then at the end of your assignment, however long that lasts, most people come back to their home countries and it can be a bit disconcerting. You may feel a little bit out of place in terms of your friends and family haven't had that experience. It's quite hard for them to relate to that experience if they haven't visited countries like that or gone through a similar experience themselves. You may be struggling to reconcile the privilege and abundance at home with the hardship and resilience you saw in Timor. So I certainly find in New Zealand, life is very comfortable. It is very easy compared to life in Timor. Timor life was hard. It was easier for me as a volunteer with the support networks that I had, but it was still harder than anywhere else I've lived. And what I had was nowhere near as hard as what the locals have to go through. It is give you a very different perspective on things, and that can be quite challenging your values and your perception of things. You may miss the pace of life, the community feel, or the sense of purpose you had while volunteering. So again, life in New Zealand is great, but it's definitely not as exhilarating as life in Dili. Every day there was something. I just walk along the streets and there was something interesting or exciting or just that caught your eye, whereas I don't get that same kind of feeling at home. And it may make you question what comes next, so personally, professionally, or philosophically. As I said, coming back to New Zealand was quite a jolt. You want to tell people about your experience, but actually most people are not that interested. It's similar if you've done lots of traveling, that you'll find that you think this is an amazing travel experience, I want to share this with others, and most people, they can't relate to it. It's not something that particularly interests them. So you just have to accept that's the case and move on and not force your Timor stories on people. There will be some people who are interested, and obviously you're typically out volunteering with other people who have also left Timor, and so you can share experiences with them. And there are still people back in Timor that I stay in touch with. So a few bits of advice just to finish with. So give yourself some time. So when you get back, don't just jump into the next thing, but have a little bit of time to reflect on the experience you've been through and think about what you're going to do going forward. Stay connected with other returned volunteers. There's often alumni networks that exist. Personally, I found it very helpful to write a diary, and I also write a blog. JontyTravels.com is my blog, and I've written a number of posts there about life in Timor-Leste, and it's a good way of kind of processing the feelings that I had in country. And then if volunteering spark something in you, consider what other roles you may be able to do. So there might be roles in international development or community work or cross-cultural engagement. And that could be in your own country, so you can volunteer at home, or look for other volunteer opportunities overseas. And that's certainly something that I've been looking for, as I've had this amazing experience in Timor. It's hard to go back. You can't repeat things, but you can maybe do something which gives a similar life experience. So hopefully this podcast has been useful for anybody considering volunteering in Timor-Leste. Thank you so much for listening to Exploring Timor-Leste. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at exploringtimorleste@gmail.com. Until next time, obrigado ho adeus.